Welcome to Professor Russell Esposito's channel on information security. This video is just one of many video modules that are part of Professor Esposito's course on the subject. Video modules for his entire information security course are located on this channel. So remember to hit the like button as well as subscribe if you enjoy the video. Thank you for watching.
Introduction to Information Security. This course on information security covers really a broad array of topics. The different kinds of malware, different kinds of attack vectors, how attacks happen, what's the sequence of events, how to stop them, what are the technologies that prevent or identify, prevent, and interfere with an attack. And that's the world of cybersecurity, the top half of this slide. The kinds of remote hacks or remote damage that can happen to your network or through the internet and as an attack to your system. We'll also cover, not as much, but we're going to cover, which is critically important, physical security, the second half of this slide, which talks about on-site theft and on-site damage. So we'll cover that in the beginning of the course. We'll have a few of the pieces in other modules that touch upon it, but the bulk of the course is really on cybersecurity. But I would be remiss if we did not cover physical security. That's critically important. If you have no physical security, you have no security. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's an advisory agency. It's not regulatory. It has no requirements, but it offers standardization for many products in many industries, everything from light bulbs to atomic clocks and nanotechnology, as well as cybersecurity, which is our focus. So this is the CIA triad, they call it, for NIST, the framework for protecting information. So there are three components. One is confidentiality. Obviously, data must be kept confidential, whether it's financial data, healthcare data, whatever it is, or your own data for your own organization, corporate data that's patents, patented information, or secrets about your company's products, military secrets, etc. Things need to be kept confidential. Data must be maintained integrity. It's got to be accurate. It can't be corrupted. It can't be changed. It's got to be kept in its entirety, in its holistic form. That's integrity. And the last thing is, what good is confidential data that's accurate with integrity if it's not available? So you have to have some way for the right people to see the right data at the right time. So you have to have availability of the data, but controlled availability, right? You got to maintain confidentiality, and you have to maintain integrity, that people or someone or some systems or bots or malware is not changing or destroying your data. That's maintaining integrity. So those are the three pieces of the CIA triad that NIST recommends. And this is sort of the fundamental concept that you have to keep in mind for all security technologies, techniques, policies, and procedures. You must always maintain this triad. It must be preserved regardless of what you do in information security. So we just looked at the NIST triad, the CIA triad, the most fundamental components of a security framework. Now let's look at it a little bit more detail. The NIST cybersecurity framework, here's an overview. So any cybersecurity program, foundation, framework any organization has should have these five pillars, these five components. You need to first identify your assets. Identify what your systems are, your software. What are the things that you need to protect? What's the priority with which they need to be protected? What's the governance? How do you manage it? How do you bring in new systems? Who authorizes that? Who decides on what fits into the rest of your infrastructure, your system infrastructure? Are there risky products you're bringing in, or risky databases that you're managing? And then you need to do a risk assessment. What are your physical risks? What are your cybersecurity risks? What systems have the most risk? What are the ways you can mitigate risks? So that gets into sort of strategy and other techniques we'll talk about in the class. And then the next column here, the next pillar, is protect. Awareness control. You have to be monitoring constantly, looking at audits, looking at logs, having the right technologies in place, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, antivirus, that sort of thing. You're protecting things. And then how do you detect when something's happening? How do you know if there's a problem? Either real time with certain systems like intrusion detection systems, or either through reviews of audits, looking back at what's happened to the system. Something simple that many companies have trouble with their audits when they're audited by a third party. Are the rights and privileges changing appropriately when employees change roles or positions? Do they lose access to systems they no longer need access to? You should always have a way to detect if there's a problem. Or when people leave the organization, are their privileges and their access to the systems, discontinued? So you need some way to real-time and prospectively detect problems. And then how do you respond? And this mostly relates to real-time problems. How do you respond to an attack, a ransomware attack, a down system because you have malware, or a what's called a denial of service? You're being attacked to bring your systems down, and you make your services unavailable to your customers and other constituents. And then how do you recover? What's your plan to recover on an incident? And how do you recover if there's a disaster? You need a disaster recovery plan, a communications plan as well. How do you communicate internally within the company? Who gets to know what? How do you communicate externally to the press, to partners, to customers? So this is a more detailed framework, a little bit that goes down a little bit deeper than the CIA triad that we just saw in the previous slide. But this is very fundamental to all cybersecurity programs, foundational work. These are the columns that must be addressed and considered when you're considering your entire security framework. Let's look at access control. It's something that we all are familiar with. So this is the core sequence, and we've all gone through this. There's identification, authentication, authorization. These are very specific terms used by cybersecurity professionals and network folks when they communicate. When there's a project they're implementing, new software for this, or there's a problem that they're debugging, they'll use these terms with these definitions. So identification is when you first identify who you are with your driver's license. You get an ID number and you get a password. Authentication is when you prove who you are. When you log on for the first time, you log on, you put in your ID, put in your password. That's authentication. And then authorization is when you get your permissions. When the server, the domain controller, usually Microsoft Active Directory, but some sort of domain controller, looks for your privileges and your permissions and gives you access to the systems, databases, printers, whatever you're supposed to have access to. So that's a very fundamental concept, and we're going to obviously get into much more detail about this with respect to the different technologies that perform these functions. Okay, so we already covered authentication and authorization, but they're part of an acronym or a AAA concept that's used in the security world. So we covered authentication, you understand that. We covered authorization. And the third A is accounting, keeping track of who's using the system, who has access to it, what resources that person or that department is consuming on the system. And of course, if somebody's ID and password is somewhat compromised and there's a hacker trying to break in, you'd see that those failed attempts. And you might want to, at that point, contact the legitimate owner of that ID and password to let them know something's happening like that. They may not, be aware, and they may want to change their password. So this concept of AAA is a common concept used in the security among security professionals. So I wanted you to be aware of that and have an understanding of it. Well, let's add one more A to this AAA and call it a quad A. So we know about authentication, authorization, and accounting. I'm going to add one more called auditing, which sometimes you see discussed as well in the business, so like a 4 A's, quad A, let's say. So auditing is really looking at all the logs. It's very, very important in information security to review the security logs of firewalls, routers, the security and event logs in machines. And there are certain reports or reporting systems that help pull all that granular data together to make it easier to report and identify data that needs to be correlated, particularly when there's different time zones, things are going on across a country or a continent, and they're happening at the same moment, but the different time stamps and different, maybe even date stamps. So you have to have a reporting system, and we'll talk about these systems later on in the course to pull that together. But auditing is really important because you have to look at when employees leave the company, You have to make sure that their password is disabled to the systems. So you have to audit that. When people change roles in the company, you have to audit to ensure that they're getting the least privilege, the least access, that they're leaving access from a system they had needed, and they're getting access to the new system they're using, but they don't retain access to both environments. That change in the role of a person is being properly done, and they ending up with least privilege. That's another important concept. Least privilege, the minimum amount of access that you need to do your job. And auditing, there's a lot of other things that you're going to audit. You're going to audit what's happening to the network and what's happening to your firewall. So it's a very important concept. And there are these, as I said earlier, these important reporting systems called SIEMs, SIEM. We'll talk about them later on. But I just wanted to introduce this other fourth concept called auditing. The very first slide we looked at talked about the difference between cybersecurity and physical security. So we are going to go into that into more detail, a lot more detail, obviously, in this course. But just to give you a sense, we talk about physical security. We're talking about fences, locks, cameras, sensors, whether it's motion sensors, heat sensors, because you need to keep your environment properly controlled, water detection in case there's a flood underneath your raised floor. So physical security is important. You may have guards, you may have fences. And then to the right of the slide is all the logical security. That's what most of the course will be about, how to protect against a cybersecurity attack. You know, with the firewalls, VLAN is a virtual local area network, VLAN, intrusion detection, intrusion protection systems, etc. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that in the course, obviously, the kinds of attacks that can happen and the ways to identify, prevent, and mitigate, and control those events and recover from those events, I should say. So these are the two important aspects of security, physical and logical. We're going to be spending a lot of time on the right-hand side of this screen on the logical piece of cybersecurity. So far we've talked about technologies and physical security, but there are really three things at play, and these are the three things that are reviewed regardless of what the audit may be. If there's a review of a company or a department, people always look at, or I should say auditors or reviewers, consultants, they're always looking at people, process, and technology. You'll hear that over and over again. And the technology, obviously, the things we talked about a little bit earlier in this presentation, you know, firewalls, VLANs, antivirus, those kinds of things, and the physical lockdown of a data center, and all your network closets, you know, the network closets in buildings that carry cables from floor to floor, from router to router and switch to switch, those kinds of things. You know, that's all good, well and good, but the technology's got to be taken care of. But there's also the process, and the process means, how is the company organized? How is the IT department organized? What are the policies and what are the procedures? What kind of governance do you have over IT? You know, what's the process for acquiring, for buying new technology? How does it get reviewed? How does it formally get reviewed? Who authorizes the purchase? Who reviews the technology? What is the team comprised of in your organization? It's usually, you know, IT people, and then IT people with the business, and they're making that decision. And there's got to be a budget, obviously. So there's got to be some governance framework, and that's all part of the process. You know, what are your policies and procedures for your acceptable use of the equipment, so that it's only used for business purposes? What are the written policies and procedures for that? How is IT integrated with the business? What's the form of that? Where are the business analysts? Where do they work? How do they integrate with IT? How do they work with IT to design changes to the system? So that's all about process. And then it's the people themselves. You know, do they have the right training? Do they have the right security awareness training, which you should get every year to protect against phishing attacks and, you know, clicking on these, you know, emails that have malware in them. So people are important. Do they get the right professional training? And also, are they following the policies and procedures? So the right-hand bubble talks about the organization's policies and procedures. What are your IT controls? What are the IT controls on your system and your process when you code new software? How does it get tested? How does it get approved? How does it get, you know, approved to put into production? What are your backout plans in case you do have a problem backing something out? So are the people following the procedures and the policies that are on the right-hand bubble here in the right-hand circle? You know, they've got to be able to follow those things. When, for example, you might have a policy that says any new router that comes in, that's going to have a default password. That password has to be changed. It'll be a written policy and a written procedure. Are the people doing that? Or you're finding equipment like routers in production or even in test environments with the default password in it. So this whole concept of people, process, and technology is always used to review any process, any department, any company. It's the only way to holistically look at what's happening. Look at the technology, look at the process and the procedures, the organization, and the people in terms of their training and how do they adhere to the policies and procedures. So this is a critically important concept as well. In the previous slide, we looked at people, process, and technology, and how those map to operational controls. The people map to operational controls. The process maps to administrative or managerial controls, and the technical maps to technologies and whether they're logical or physical, like a firewall or a physical lock or a fence. In this slide, we'll break it out a little bit, and then we'll connect some dots here. So if you look at the core security framework on the left half of this slide, and if you go down, you see the administrative is policies, technical is logical technical firewalls, and we separate that from the physical technologies like the locks at the bottom here, physical locks. So the only thing different here is we're going a little more granular. In the previous slide with the three bubbles, people, processing, technology, we had technologies combined regardless of whether they were logical firewalls or physical locks. Here we're being a little more granular. So we've got the same concept here in this control type. We have administrative, technology, physical, and operational, right? We talked about the operational, the people piece of it, the people bubble in the previous slide, which spoke to are people following the procedures. So that's I just wanted to clarify that. And then at the bottom, I have a comment about deterrence controls. Well, let's hold off on that. Look at the left-hand side, control class, detect, prevent, and correct problems, right? Or attacks. Detect, prevent them, and correct if there is a problem. Some experts have another category called deterrence control. So at the bottom, I have a note here, and I have that gray because, sometimes it overlaps. Some security experts break out deterrent controls, but many overlap with preventive controls. So for example, a firewall or a physical fence, that could deter a hacker who sees a firewall or sees a physical fence. They may be deterred and go somewhere else, but it may also prevent an attack. So so this slide doesn't really talk about deterrence, and that's okay because there is sort of a gray area where they kind of overlap. So if we look at the core security framework, now that we have that sort of preface taken out of the way, if you look at the core security framework, you've got control class on the left, detect, prevent, correct, control type on the right, administrative or managerial, technical, logical, operational, procedural, and physical. And we have in the middle of that the NIST functions. We saw in an earlier slide, we saw how NIST had that different functions: identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover as you go down this colorful path under the core security framework. So they map to detect. You have to first identify what your assets are before you can even detect if there's a problem with one of your assets. So identify your assets, detect if there's a problem. That maps to detect on the left-hand side. The next NIST function is protect, and that maps to prevent a control that prevents a problem. So you have to protect your assets, your system, and your data by preventing things from happening. And then if you go down further in the NIST function, respond and recover, that maps to the correct control, to correcting a control that corrects a problem. You have to respond and maybe recover with a backup tape or a backup data center in a disaster recovery plan. So I think this gives you sort of a high level, and we'll go through a lot of the very specific physical controls, logical controls, procedures. We're going to go through a lot of this in the coming modules, but I just wanted to map this out to give you a sense at a very high level of how things are sort of aligned and how these, what a core security framework looks like, and how we have a control class on the left, a NIST function that maps to that, and then the various control types. And again, there could be some overlap with some things in terms of how control types map and overlap with a procedure and a policy that could overlap. But don't fret. It's just an idea, just a conceptual idea of how things are going to be put together. And when you have when you're designing a security framework, you kind of have to have all of these components in mind. And then to the right-hand side, I'm going to skip the middle. Control category, automated and manual. I mean, I think that's sort of, common sense. Some of these things are manual, some of these things are automated. But I want to bring you to the right-hand side of this slide, a risk assessment. And we're going to talk more about risk assessments in other modules. But really, when you look at all of your potential problems, you look at two things. Is it likely to happen? Is it a high likelihood or low likelihood? And what's the impact? And that, how does it impact the organization if it fails, if it's been attacked, if it's been being, brought down by a hacker? And that gives you your control risk. In other words, how much money and how much time and effort are you going to put into controlling that risk? So for example, it's probably likely that you're going to have some kind of outage with your, let's say, email server. What's the impact? Fairly high. So that's that you're going to put some effort into making sure your email server doesn't go down. What's the likelihood of your entire data center, all of your assets in your data center, all of your computers? What's the likelihood of that being completely destroyed? Highly unlikely, but it has a high impact if it happens. So you have to spend some time looking at it. But something that's got a low impact and low likelihood, you're not going to put a lot of time, money, and effort into it. Your control risk is not going to be very aggressive. But something that's got a high likelihood of happening and a high impact, like a ransomware attack, is pretty likely and pretty impactful. So you're going to put some money into that. You're going to put some effort into that control risk. So I just wanted to give you, don't worry about memorizing all these little things, all these little pieces. Just get an understanding of how they all line up and how they connect to each other, because this is really sort of the roadmap of how you build, a security framework and how you're going to design risk assessment. And we're going to go through lots of details in the coming modules on how each one of these little boxes here is built out. I thought this was sort of just a cute cartoon. It looks like the father is very confused about the son's costume for this particular Halloween, and this son is describing his costume. I'm a phishing email for Halloween, Dad. See how it asks you to click on a link to verify your account? Didn't we go over this? So it looks like the kid has the concept down pat, and the father might still be a little bit confused about what's happening in terms of cybersecurity. So I want you to watch these two videos. You can get the links from the schedule or from the syllabus and link out to these websites, to YouTube, or you can cut and paste the URL. But this is a research paper that'll be due the end of week 3, and the date will be posted, the exact date for the due date for the research. Watch these videos, do some research, look at other videos, do other web searches to find more information on Shodan and Wiggle. And Shodan basically collects information throughout the internet. It's collecting Internet of Things, IoT, information about IoT devices. So it's good for researchers and application developers, but it's also useful for hackers. So everything has a double-edged sword, right? And Wiggle.net is a site that collects Wi-Fi locations. Similarly, it could be used for research, it could be used for hacking. So do the research, follow the instructions for your research paper that's posted in Blackboard. Watch these videos, get the links from either the schedule or from the syllabus, and look forward to reading the papers. This concludes the introduction to information security.